in the Green Mountains of Vermont, where autumn transforms the landscape into flames of red and gold, where small villages cling to hillsides and fog rolls through valleys like water finding its level, there existed in 1914 a town called Ashford Mills, population 312 souls, surviving on dairy farming, maple syrup production, and the kind of quiet, predictable life that seemed to exist outside the rush of modern progress sweeping across America in the early 20th century. The town's pride was its one-room schoolhouse, a white clapboard building with a bell tower and windows that looked out over fields where children could watch the seasons change while learning their letters and sums. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a 15-minute walk from the village center along a dirt road lined with sugar maples and stone walls built by farmers' hands over generations. In September of 1914, the school was overseen by Margaret Rose Sullivan, a woman of 28 years, unmarried. Originally from Burlington, but having lived in Ashford Mills for 3 years since accepting the teaching position. Margaret was remembered by those who knew her as remarkable primarily for being unremarkable. She was kind but not effusive, intelligent but not intimidating, attractive but not beautiful, the sort of person who seemed designed to fit comfortably into small-town life without causing disruption or drawing excessive attention. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, had auburn hair that she wore in a practical bun, gray-blue eyes that students remembered as kind, and a fondness for wearing simple dark dresses with white collars, the uniform of respectable unmarried teachers throughout rural America. Margaret lived in a boarding house run by Mrs. Edith Crawford, a widow of 60 who provided rooms for the teacher, the town's doctor, and occasionally traveling salesmen or other transients passing through the area. Mrs. Crawford would later testify that Margaret was an ideal tenant, quiet, clean, always paid rent on time, caused no trouble, kept to herself but was never unfriendly. She would describe Margaret as steady. That was the word she used most often. Steady, like a clock that neither gained nor lost time. Reliable in ways that made her invisible, until suddenly she wasn't there at all. The day Margaret disappeared was October 23, 1914, a Friday afternoon with weather that locals remembered as unseasonably warm for late autumn, the kind of day where the air itself seemed golden, where the light had a quality that made everything look soft-edged and slightly unreal. School had let out at 3 o'clock as usual, Margaret dismissing her 17 students ranging in age from 6 to 14 after a day spent teaching arithmetic, reading, and history. Several students later recalled that Miss Sullivan had seemed perfectly normal that day, perhaps slightly distracted, but nothing that raised concern. She had helped young Tommy Hartwell with his spelling, praised Sarah Jenkins for her improvement in long division, and mediated a dispute between 2 older boys about who would be responsible for bringing in firewood the following week. Perfectly ordinary teaching, perfectly ordinary interactions, nothing to suggest that within hours she would vanish from the world for 6 years. Margaret left the schoolhouse at approximately 3:30 after completing her usual routine of cleaning the blackboard, straightening desks, and preparing materials for Monday's lessons. She was seen by several people during her walk back toward town. Samuel Peterson, delivering milk, passed her on the road and tipped his hat, receiving a smile and nod in return. Elizabeth Morrison, hanging laundry in her yard, called out a greeting that Margaret returned. Young Daniel Foster, fishing in the creek that ran parallel to the road, waved as she passed, and she waved back. All 3 witnesses would later tell investigators that Margaret seemed completely normal, walking at her usual pace, showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. The point where Margaret Sullivan ceased to exist, at least in any verifiable sense, was a section of road about half a mile from town center, a stretch that passed through a grove of ancient maple trees that created a natural tunnel of branches overhead. This section of road had no houses nearby, no clear sight lines from surrounding farms, a pocket of isolation in an otherwise well-traveled route. Daniel Foster, the boy fishing in the creek, would be the last person to see Margaret enter that grove of trees. He continued fishing for perhaps 20 minutes before heading home himself, walking the same road Margaret had taken. He passed through the maple grove and saw nothing unusual, no sign of Miss Sullivan or any indication that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. Margaret failed to arrive at Mrs. Crawford's boarding house for the Friday evening meal, served promptly at 6 o'clock. This was unusual enough that Mrs. Crawford mentioned it to Dr. Henry Whitmore, another boarder, noting that Margaret had never missed a meal without prior notice in 3 years of residence. Dr. Whitmore suggested that perhaps Margaret had been invited to dine with one of the students' families, something that happened occasionally. But when Margaret hadn't returned by 10 o'clock, and her room showed no signs of her having come back to change clothes or collect anything, Mrs. Crawford's concern escalated into alarm. The town constable, Thomas Burke, was notified at 11 o'clock that evening. Burke was a man of 53 who had served as constable for 20 years without encountering anything more serious than disputes over property lines and the occasional drunk and disorderly charge. He initially assumed that Margaret had perhaps gone to visit a friend and lost track of time, or possibly had taken ill while walking and sought help at a nearby farm. But a cursory search of the route between the schoolhouse and town revealed nothing. No sign of Margaret, no indication of where she might have gone or what might have happened to her. By Saturday morning, half the town was involved in the search. Men combed the fields and forests surrounding the road Margaret had walked. They checked barns, outbuildings, abandoned structures, any place a person might have taken shelter or been confined. They dragged the creek, searched the woods, covered every inch of ground for miles in all directions. Margaret's room at the boarding house was examined thoroughly. Her belongings were all present: clothes in the wardrobe, personal items arranged neatly on her dresser, a half-finished letter to her sister in Burlington, sitting on the writing desk. The letter was dated October 22nd, the day before her disappearance, and contained nothing unusual. General news about the school, comments about the weather, inquiries about family members. It gave no hint of any plans to leave, no suggestion of distress or unusual circumstances in Margaret's life. The investigation was taken over by Vermont State Police after 3 days produced no leads. Detective William Harrison, an experienced investigator from Montpelier, spent 2 weeks in Ashford Mills conducting thorough interviews with everyone who had known or interacted with Margaret. He examined her financial records, which showed a modest teacher's salary being regularly deposited and regularly spent on necessities with small amounts sent to her parents each month. He investigated whether Margaret might have had a secret romantic relationship that could explain a sudden departure, but found no evidence of any such connection. He checked with train stations, bus lines, and livery stables throughout the region, searching for any record of Margaret purchasing transportation or being seen traveling. Nothing. Detective Harrison's final report, filed in December of 1914, concluded that Margaret Rose Sullivan had most likely been the victim of foul play, possibly abducted by a transient passing through the area, though he acknowledged the complete absence of physical evidence was highly unusual. He noted that the section of road where Margaret was last seen offered a brief window of opportunity for an attack, but emphasized that any such attack would have had to be executed with remarkable speed and silence to avoid detection by Daniel Foster, who passed through the same location only 20 minutes later. The case remained open but without new leads, gradually fading from active investigation as months passed and no new information emerged. Margaret's parents traveled from Burlington to collect her belongings and settle her affairs. Her room at the boarding house was let to a new tenant, and a new teacher was hired for the school. Life in Ashford Mills returned to its usual rhythms, though the mystery of what happened to Margaret Sullivan remained a topic of speculation and concern. Some believed she had been murdered, her body hidden so thoroughly that it might never be found. Others suggested she had deliberately fled her life for reasons known only to herself, perhaps pregnant or involved in some scandal she couldn't face. A few entertained darker possibilities that she had been taken by someone with criminal intent, held captive somewhere, suffering a fate too terrible to speak aloud. The truth, when it emerged 6 years later, proved stranger than any of the speculation. On October 23, 1920, exactly 6 years to the day after her disappearance, a farmer named Jacob Thornton was driving his wagon along the road from town when he saw a woman standing in the maple grove where Margaret had last been seen. He stopped to offer assistance, thinking perhaps someone's automobile had broken down. This being 1920, when such vehicles were becoming more common, though still unreliable. The woman turned as he approached, and Jacob Thornton found himself looking at a face he recognized from 6 years of speculation and memory. Margaret Rose Sullivan, looking exactly as she had the day she vanished. She was wearing the same dark dress with white collar that witnesses had described from October 1914, her hair arranged in the same style, her appearance completely unchanged by 6 years that should have marked her with age and experience. When Jacob asked if she needed help, Margaret looked at him with confusion and asked what time it was, saying she needed to get back to Mrs. Crawford's boarding house before the evening meal. Jacob, badly shaken, managed to explain that it wasn't 1914 anymore, that 6 years had passed, that she'd been missing, and everyone had thought her dead or worse. Margaret's response was to look even more confused, insisting that she had just left the schoolhouse, that it was Friday afternoon, that she needed to get home. She had no awareness that time had passed, no memory of anything between leaving the schoolhouse in October 1914 and standing in the maple grove in October 1920. Jacob Thornton drove Margaret directly to Dr. Whitmore, who still maintained his practice in Ashford Mills. Dr. Whitmore, confronted with a woman he'd known 6 years earlier, looking exactly as she had the day she disappeared, conducted a thorough physical examination. His findings, documented in medical records that still exist in Vermont State Archives, were deeply puzzling. Margaret showed no signs of malnutrition or physical abuse. She appeared to be in perfect health, with one extraordinary exception. By all biological markers he could measure, she hadn't aged at all. Her teeth showed no additional wear. Her skin had no new lines or marks. Even her fingernails were the length they would be after a normal week of growth. Not 6 years. Most disturbingly, when Dr. Whitmore examined her more intimately, he found that Margaret's body showed no signs of having experienced 6 years of monthly cycles. Her physical state suggested that no time had passed for her at all, that she had somehow stepped out of October 1914 and back into reality in October 1920, without experiencing any of the moments in between. Margaret's mental state was equally puzzling. She had perfect memory of her life up until October 23, 1914. She could recall the morning's lessons, the students' faces, the walk from the schoolhouse, entering the maple grove. After that, nothing, just a gap, and then standing in the grove again with a farmer staring at her as if she were a ghost. She had no dreams to recall, no sense of time passing, no awareness of being anywhere or experiencing anything during those 6 missing years. It was, she described, like closing her eyes for a blink and opening them to find the world had aged while she stood still. Dr. Whitmore contacted authorities in Montpelier, who sent specialists to examine this medical anomaly. Over the following months, Margaret was studied by doctors from the state hospital, psychologists from the university, and neurologists from Boston who traveled specifically to examine this case. Every test they could conceive was conducted, every possible explanation explored. The results were consistent and utterly baffling. Margaret Rose Sullivan had experienced no time passing between October 1914 and October 1920 internormal. Her body hadn't aged, her memories showed no gap that she was aware of, and every objective measure suggested that, from her perspective, no time had elapsed at all. Theories were proposed and discarded. Some doctors suggested an extreme form of dissociative fugue, a psychological condition where people lose awareness of their identity and wander for extended periods. But Margaret had no false memories of being someone else, no recollection of any experiences during the missing years, and most critically, her body showed no signs of having lived through 6 years of physical existence. Others proposed that she had been held captive somewhere in a state of unconsciousness, perhaps drugged continuously. This couldn't explain the lack of aging or the absence of any physical indicators of such confinement. The absence of muscle atrophy alone made prolonged unconsciousness impossible. Humans who are comatose or sedated for extended periods show clear physical signs of deterioration that Margaret simply didn't display. One neurologist from Harvard, Dr. Richard Ashford, spent 3 weeks examining Margaret and studying her case in detail. His final report, published in a limited circulation medical journal, proposed something unprecedented: that Margaret had experienced what he termed a temporal discontinuity, a gap in the normal flow of time as she experienced it. He acknowledged this was scientifically impossible by all current understanding of physics and biology, but argued that the evidence was incompatible with any other explanation. His paper was largely dismissed by the medical establishment, with most doctors preferring to label the case as an elaborate hoax or a psychological condition not yet understood, rather than accept implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of time and human consciousness. Margaret herself struggled to adjust to a world that had moved forward without her. The First World War, which had barely begun when she disappeared, had concluded. The country had changed in ways both subtle and profound. People she had known were 6 years older. Some had died. Children had been born and started school. The town she remembered had evolved while she stood frozen. She attempted to resume teaching but found the work impossible when students she remembered as 8 years old were now 14 and no longer saw her as an authority figure. Her parents, who had mourned her as dead, found her reappearance more disturbing than comforting, unable to reconcile the unchanged daughter with the years of grief they'd experienced. Friends and acquaintances didn't know how to interact with someone who was simultaneously familiar and fundamentally wrong, a person out of sync with the natural flow of time. Mrs. Crawford offered to let Margaret return to her old room at the boarding house, but Margaret found she couldn't sleep in that space, couldn't close her eyes without fearing she would open them to find another 6 years had passed, or that she would slip back into whatever gap in time had held her before. She moved to Burlington to live with her sister, hoping that a larger city would make adjustment easier. That anonymity might be easier to achieve than in small-town Ashford Mills, where everyone knew her story. But Burlington proved no better. Margaret found employment as a clerk in a department store, work that didn't require the personal connections teaching had demanded. But she struggled with the changes in fashion, technology, and social norms that had occurred during her missing years. She was 28 years old chronologically, 34 by calendar years, but felt ancient in ways that had nothing to do with either number. A person who had experienced something that separated her fundamentally from everyone around her. In 1923, Margaret accepted a position teaching at a small school in northern Vermont, far from Ashford Mills, where no one knew her story, and she could exist without constant questions and stares. She taught there for 7 years, living quietly, forming no deep friendships, maintaining a life of careful routine that seemed designed to avoid any possibility of further temporal anomalies. Students from this period remembered her as distant but fair, a teacher who seemed somehow sad, as if mourning something she couldn't explain. On October 23, 1930, exactly 16 years after her first disappearance and 10 years after her reappearance, Margaret Rose Sullivan vanished again. She had taken a walk during her lunch break, a routine she followed daily, and simply didn't return to the school. The search that followed was thorough, but revealed nothing. Margaret had vanished as completely as she had in 1914, leaving no trace, no explanation, no clue about where she had gone or what had happened to her. This time, there was no reappearance. No one has seen Margaret Rose Sullivan since October 23, 1930. The school where she taught kept her position open for a full year, hoping she might return as inexplicably as she had before. But as months passed without any sign of her, the position was filled and life moved forward. The case file was closed, marked as a missing person presumed dead, though the circumstances were too unusual to allow for any comfortable conclusions. The medical records from Margaret's examination in 1920 remain in Vermont State Archives, accessible to researchers, a documented case of something that shouldn't be possible but apparently was. Dr. Richard Ashford's paper proposing temporal discontinuity is still occasionally cited by researchers working at the fringes of physics and consciousness studies, though mainstream science has never accepted his conclusions. The maple grove where Margaret vanished, both times, still exists along the road outside Ashford Mills, now paved and busy with automobile traffic, but otherwise much the same as it was in 1914. Locals who know the story avoid that section of road on October 23rd, a superstition perhaps, but one born from a case that defied every rational explanation. Some researchers have investigated whether there's something unusual about that location, some localized phenomenon that could explain temporal anomalies, but no evidence has ever been found of anything out of the ordinary. The site has normal magnetic fields, no unusual geological features, no history of other disappearances or strange occurrences. It's just a section of road lined with maple trees, unremarkable except for the fact that twice, exactly 6 years apart, it swallowed a woman who reappeared only once before being taken again, this time forever. Margaret's family eventually stopped hoping for another return. Her parents passed away in the 1940s, having spent years watching calendar pages turn on October 23rds, looking for a daughter who never came home. Her sister moved to California after the war, seeking distance from memories and questions that had no answers. The last known relative who remembered Margaret directly died in 1989. Taking with her personal recollections of the woman who walked out of time and briefly back into it before vanishing again into whatever space existed between moments. What happened to Margaret Rose Sullivan remains one of the most thoroughly documented and yet completely unexplained disappearances in American history. The 1920 medical examinations provide objective evidence that something extraordinary occurred, that a woman missing for 6 years returned showing no signs of having lived through that time. The testimonies of dozens of witnesses confirm the facts of both disappearances and the single reappearance. The case file, available to anyone who requests it, offers no conventional explanation that fits all the evidence. Some researchers have proposed that Margaret experienced a rare psychological condition that somehow affected her physical aging, though no known condition can halt aging completely or explain the absence of biological processes like menstruation. Others suggest she was held in some facility where aging was artificially prevented through unknown means, though this raises questions about who would do such a thing and why, and where she could have been held without any evidence of her confinement ever emerging. A few investigators have suggested the entire case might be an elaborate hoax, that the Margaret who reappeared in 1920 was an imposter who resembled the original, but the medical examinations were too thorough and conducted by too many independent experts for this explanation to hold weight. The most unsettling possibility, the one that Dr. Ashford proposed and that the evidence seems most strongly to support, is that Margaret somehow stepped outside of time, that for 6 years she existed in some state where time didn't affect her, and that whatever allowed or caused this to happen took her back in 1930, permanently this time, to a place or state that exists beyond our ability to observe or understand. If this story revealed something you never knew about the mysteries of human consciousness and the nature of time, leave a comment telling us what surprised you most. And if you want more untold stories of people who vanished in ways that defy explanation, subscribe. These stories matter, not just as history, but as reminders that reality is stranger than we admit, that the world contains phenomena we don't understand, and perhaps never will, that the boundaries between possible and impossible are less certain than we'd like to believe. Margaret Rose Sullivan walked out of time twice, returned once, and left behind a mystery that nearly a century later remains as baffling as it was the day she stepped out of that maple grove, looking exactly as she had 6 years earlier, asking what time it was, unaware that that time had moved forward without her, while she stood still in some space between moments, some gap in the fabric of reality that opened twice and closed forever the second time, taking her to a place where teachers who vanish might finally find answers to questions the rest of us can barely formulate, let alone hope to answer.